If there is no word for it, how do you think about it? Reflects the central topic of a sci-fi masterwork known for its discussion on linguistic relativity. I'm talking about Babel-17, a Nebula Award-winning novel by Samuel R. Delaney. Let's get this book undone. Hello everyone, and welcome to Books Undone. I'm your host, Livia J. Elliot, and today we will discuss Babel-17, written by Samuel R. Delaney. I came across it thanks to a recommendation from a BookTube channel I watch regularly, Joanna Reads. Her link will be in the description. This book is also part of the SF Masterwork collection and was published in 1966. It remains unequivocally original and unique, yet at the same time deep and thoughtful. Let's start with the usual disclaimers. First, there are spoilers in this podcast, so please be aware of it. Second, as usual, what you will hear is my subjective analysis of this book, so you are allowed and entitled to disagree and differ. Let's start with some trivia. Linguistic relativity is a principle suggesting that the structure of a language influences its speaker's worldview and cognition, and thus that an individual's spoken languages determine or shape their perceptions of the world. When Babel-17 was published, this hypothesis was at a peak of popularity. Back then, it was referred to as Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, first advanced by Edward Sapir in 1929 and subsequently developed by his student Benjamin Whorf. Eventually, this idea split up into two versions. The strong hypothesis is now referred to as linguistic determinism, and states that language determines thought and that linguistic categories limit and restrict cognitive categories. This version argues that individuals experience the world based on the structure of the language they commonly use, and by extension, that people from different cultures think differently because of differences in their language. However, and without getting into the details, several researchers eventually discredited the idea of linguistic determinism. The weak hypothesis, known as linguistic relativity, appeared later. In other words, neither Sapir nor Whorf proposed this dichotomy. The linguistic relativity idea states that language influences thought, but does not determine it. There is quite more to these two ideas, so I will leave a link in the description. Knowing these ideas is important because Babel-17 goes around the idea of linguistic determinism, the strong Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, using word building and the main character's mission to actually exemplify why linguistic determinism is not quite right. Although linguistic determinism was quite popular by the mid-60s, in an interview with the Paris Review, Delaney said, "What's wrong with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is that it fails to take into account the whole economy of discourse, which is a linguistic level that accomplishes lots of the soft-edge conceptual contouring around ideas. Discourse is what generates the values and suggestions around a concept, even if the concept has no name or hasn't the name it will eventually have. I think it is reasonable to say that if language is what allows us to think about things, then discourse is what controls the way we think about things, and the second, discourse, has primacy." As I see it, that quote leads us to the central theme of Babel-17, which we will discuss in this episode as outlined by the opening question. What happens when you are missing words? I'm bilingual, and when I read some parts of Babel-17, I ended up relating quite a bit and thinking about the daily issues almost every bilingual or polyglot person has. Namely, that the right word is never in the language that you are speaking at that moment, or that an idea can be better and perhaps more succinctly expressed in another language. If my listener knows both languages, we will switch back and forth because that actually yields a more accurate expression. But if they don't share the same languages that I know, I may end up going around the missing word using others in what Delaney just called soft-ish conceptual contouring around ideas. Let's see how that played out in Babel-17. Babel-17, the novel, is named after a quote-unquote code that the Alliance Navy found preceding some attacks by the other human faction called invaders. Our main character, Rydra Wong, is a polyglot and savant poetess with a keen understanding of language and sound. And early on, she realizes that Babel-17 is not a code, but a fully fledged language. Rydra uncovered that Babel-17 has its own grammar, words, and ways of threading thought, which is quite an interesting point. In a stream of consciousness about languages, Rydra questions herself, asking, if there is no word for it, how do you think about it? And effectively kickstarts part of the main theme of this book. If you go for the linguistic determinism, the strong Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, Rydra seems to answer that question by saying, in the beginning was a word. Until something is named, it doesn't exist. To put it simply, you can't think of something you can't summarize as a word in a language that you know. This is focusing on verbal language only, seemingly disregarding discourse. The complexity of our natural languages makes us, humans, different from every other known life form of this planet. In a conversation, Rydra somewhat supports this idea by stating that language is thought. Thought is information given form, the form is language. Therefore, words are the key to advanced ideas. Through our languages, we can shape our ideas and emotions to communicate them in a way that will be roughly understood by other people. Therefore, if a single word can be used to express an idea without generating any ambivalence, then it is easy to express. Nevertheless, you may have plenty of words available, yet none of them may be enough to express a very concrete idea. That ambivalence in the words, namely the lack of accurate words, doesn't mean we cannot think beyond the limits of our current language. It probably happened to everyone. You are trying to explain something to a friend or colleague, but none of the words are just it. They all feel approximations, some better, some worse, but never quite right. And what do we do in that case? If you know multiple languages, you will intuitively resort to think in another that is more accurate. Otherwise, we will likely ramble. We will launch into a descriptive explanation, resorting to metaphors and comparisons and using other words to try to express the idea behind that concept without a specific word for it. That is the conceptual contouring around ideas from Delaney's quote. To some extent, you could argue that natural languages continue to evolve because we humans continue to need more words to express ideas in a more concrete way. When analyzing these hiccups and shortages across languages, Rydra thinks that words are names for things, adding that words are symbols for whole categories of things when a name was put to a single object. The author, Samuel Delaney, used a bit of word building to ingeniously exemplify this idea. In this book, there are 7 alien races, but humans really don't interact that much with aliens. Why? According to Rydra Wong, because compatibility factors for communication are incredibly low. So that means that some concepts are very difficult to translate from one language to another. Language is influenced by the needs of a society or group. A great example of that is technical language around a specific topic or discipline. If you are working in medicine, you will probably know plenty of words for very nuanced behaviors, symptoms and whatnots of the human body. Likewise, if you are a software developer, you will have plenty of specialized terms for problems when developing, coding itself, memory issues, and so on. In Babel-17, there is an avian-like race called Cerebians, and their entire culture emphasizes temperature, because everything around them depends on temperature. From the seasons, the mating cycles, the building structures, and even interstellar travel work based on temperature. It's so central to these Cerebians that their language can be extremely nuanced around that quote-unquote technical topic. Rydra explains these aliens have 3 words for I depending on the temperature they feel, and then she shares an anecdote of one Cerebian finding a solar heat conversion system and explaining it to another with the proper accurate words. Let me read an excerpt. One Cerebian can slither through that plant and then go and describe it to another Cerebian who never saw it before, so that the second can build an exact duplicate. And this actually happened because they thought we have done something ingenious, where each piece is located, how big it is, in short, completely describe the whole business in 9 words. 9 very small words too. They have the proper 9 words, we don't. For the temperature-based Cerebians, a solar heat conversion system was easy to explain because their temperature-based society had crafted a language that made it easy to communicate about temperature. They had no ambivalence around that topic, and their words were very accurate and nuanced for it. However, Cerebians had no concept of family or home because their society just worked differently. Rydra explains the following. When we were preparing the treaty between the Cerebians and ourselves, someone said, "We must protect our families and our homes." I remember that sentence took 45 minutes to say in Cerebian. At the end, you have given them some idea of what a home is and why it's worth protecting. Think of it this way. If you have the proper, accurate words, the communication is easy and less prone to error and confusion. It will be a case of you can say more with less, and sharing of ideas is accurate and quick. If you don't have the proper words, we all probably know what happens: miscommunication, misunderstandings, and overall confusion. We end up going around in long sentences to explain ourselves, contorting around gaps in wording, but we can still think about it. It is not a case of it doesn't exist to us, but more of lacking a concrete name, thus having a vague idea that requires a lot of description to be shared. Now, this idea of concreteness and accuracy in wording will eventually lead us back to Babel-17, the language that Rydra is actually trying to understand and trace its origins. But before we can reach it, we need to make a detour to body language. Body language is the use of physical behavior, expressions, and mannerism to communicate non-verbally. It uses expressions to emphasize or alter the meaning of the words we use. So, if somebody tells you, "I'm fine," but they are crying and grimacing, you will probably understand that they are lying and are not actually fine. On the contrary, if they say, "I'm fine," while grinning and being generally ecstatic, you will guess that they are feeling very happy and excited about something. Rydra Wong is very good at reading a person's body language, to the point she can more or less guess their thoughts from it. For example, the general she meets at the start refuses, in classical military style, to give her all the information Rydra needs to understand Babel-17, the language. Rydra reads the general's body language and guesses his words. Then she explains how she did this to her own therapist. Let me read this passage. "I said I had to have it or I couldn't get any further. It was that simple." He raised his head just a fraction to avoid shaking it. If he had shaken his head with a slight pursing of the lips. What do you think he would have been saying? The therapist, Dr. Tungwarba, replies that it wasn't as simple as you thought. However, Rydra continues. Yes, now he made one gesture to avoid making that one. He avoided the gesture because he connected it not being that simple with my being there. So he raised his head instead. The therapist guesses that the gestures means, if it were that simple, we wouldn't need you. But apparently, the good old general made a pause in the middle of the gesture combination, which Rydra further adds to the meaning, translating the sequence of gestures to words as follows. If it were that simple, now the pause, if only it were that simple, we wouldn't have called you about it. As a base layer, you have verbal language, what we say, but body language can add more to it. Other layers of meanings are how we say it, the intonation, the pauses, the emphasis, and the topic of conversation, because someone could be talking metaphorically. Let's return to the idea of accuracy and conciseness of words. What if your language could, very succinctly yet detailed and systematically, describe everything, including body language and the other layers of meanings, into words? That is the idea behind Babel-17 as a fictional language. Rydra tries this in a very curious chapter, thinking that Babel-17 was not only a language, she understood now, but a flexible matrix of analytical possibilities where the same words define the stresses in a webbing of medical bandage or a defensive grid of spaceships. Perhaps the flicker of eyelids and fingers will become mathematics without meaning, or perhaps, while she thought, her mind changed gears into the headlong compactness of Babel-17. And from there, I kid you not, begins a 3 pages long, single-sentence paragraph of Rydra's extremely detailed analysis as she quote-unquote reads a room where she's in, making inferences about the people there while thinking in Babel-17. The text is quite quirkily printed with some small paragraphs at the side, which I interpreted as the quote-unquote translations of Rydra Babel-17 rant into English, and they lose so much meaning. But that is the point of that entire section. Because Babel-17 is compact, as Rydra describes it, and it allows her to express or convey more complex and complete ideas with fewer words, Rydra believes that time slows down while she's thinking in Babel-17. It is not time-related science, in my opinion, but just a figure of speech. If your language is more effective at communicating something, like the 9 words for the Cerebians, you can think more in less time, because language is how we express thought. The less effective your language is, the more time you need to put things into words, like the 45 minutes taken to explain what home is to the aforementioned Cerebians. I'm trying not to spoil much of the plot, but after the Babel-17 analysis of the room, Rydra recites a poem of what she saw in English. Thus, the narrator says, she had been thinking in Babel-17 and choosing her English words with it, and the poem ends up being strange. I'm honestly not a reader of poems, but I gathered that Rydra was doing a literal translation, namely reconstructing what she saw and thought on Babel-17 into English, instead of doing a free translation in which you aim to convey the intent and nuance of a source text in addition to its literal meaning. As a bilingual, I found that quite relatable. Sometimes it has happened to me that a saying in Spanish, my native language, makes so much sense for a particular moment, but then, when translated, it just doesn't. Something is missing and no amount of explanation can help. The opposite also happens in which I want to explain an English word or saying to someone who doesn't speak, and it is just so difficult. Rydra actually reaches this conclusion, saying that if you have the right words, it saves time and makes things easier. In Delaney's Babel-17, humans have two factions. Faction number 1 is called Alliance, where Rydra belongs. Faction number 2 is called Invaders. The Invaders, as named by the Alliance, created the language Babel-17. Do you know how the word Alliance translates to Babel-17? It translates as one who has invaded. That quote-unquote name is already biasing a Babel-17 speaker, likely conditioning their thoughts. According to linguistic determinism, an invader speaking Babel-17 wouldn't be able to think of a human from the Alliance faction as nothing else but an intruder, somebody coming to take something from them. In this sense, language determines thoughts, as per the strong Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Now, the language of Babel-17 has another quirkiness. It lacks the word for I. If you remember the linguistic determinism, Ryder's explanation is sensible. She says, the lack of an I precludes any self-critical process. In fact, it cuts out any awareness of the symbolic process at all, which is the way we distinguish between reality and our expression of reality. The lack of an I blinds you to the fact that though Babel-17 is a highly useful way to look at things, it isn't the only way. Let me ask you a question. Suppose that someone, a rational being with the ability for language, exists speaking only on Babel-17 without knowing any other language. How will they express the self, the idea of oneself? How could you say, I feel, or I want, or I need, if there is no such concept, or if you can't verbally express it? You will have to go around other words, other concepts, or they could resort to body language. In this book, there is a character who only speaks Babel-17 called Butcher, and he beats his chest when he should say I. Using her observation and perhaps translation skills, Rydra gauges that the butcher using the fist on chest gesture was to compensate for the lack of the word I. Thus, she decides to teach Butcher the word I. Butcher asks, what is I? Rydra explains that, first of all, it's very important, a good deal more important than anything else. The brain will let any number of things go to pot as long as I stays alive. That's because the brain is part of I. A book is, a ship is, someone is, the universe is, but as you must have noticed, I am. So, if Babel-17 lacks the concept of the self and you can't think of it in any way, how can this Babel-17 speaker protect the self? They will just follow their missions and orders without caring for survival. Except Butcher does it by instinct. Because, remember, we humans are ingenious. If we don't have the word for it, we go around with other approximations or we add layers of meaning. Body language, the fist in the chest, the pose and the gesture, to circumvent what we are missing. That talk when Rydra teaches Butcher the word I is quite confusing because Butcher flips it. Having just learned it, he uses I when referring to Rydra, namely when he should have used you. She explains that, look, every time you have said you in the last 10 minutes, you should have said I. Every time you have said I, you mean you. They both mean the same sort of thing. In a way, they are the same. That is quite an important realization, don't you think? If the I will let many things go to pot just to survive, then we shouldn't damage other people because they are eyes as well who will also want to survive. Rydra actually tells the butcher that, and that's why you can't go around killing people. At least you better do a hell of a lot of thinking before you do. A pacifist realization, right? As I see it, that is because of the meaning carried through the word I. We are valuable. We are meant to survive. If I want to thrive, then so do you. And if I want respect, then so do you. Knowing I and attaching feelings to it generates empathy by bridging understanding of the needs of others. Alas, we are close to the episode's end. Babel-17 truly has a lot more to discuss. Translation and speaking multiple languages are discussed quite often. It is also an original and unique story in terms of world building, and more curiously, it remains unique even now, almost 6 decades after its publication. Nevertheless, this is not a book for everyone. It's unique, it's different, and being about language, it uses phrasing and prose in a strange way to convey the structure of another language while being written solely in English. So, a piece of advice: don't go for the audiobook. Read or do immersive reading. In any case, I may do another episode about language in novels, touching one of my favorites, Orwell's Newspeak from 1984. The reason for this is that I wrote an interactive story about emotional language upcoming to Unearthed Stories, and I'm quite keen on continuing to explore this topic. However, I can't promise any dates. In any case, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Babel-17. Thanks for listening and happy reading.